Ladies and gentlemen, we are progressing at quite a rate of knots, let me tell you, through this opening day of this inaugural WFS Live event powered by Ronaldo. Before we move on to our third session today, let me just update you on some housekeeping that we mentioned a little earlier on. Just if you're using the platform, if you're an attendee or a delegate who's using this platform and you'd like to ask a question, the protocol that we suggest is that if you're on a laptop or a desktop, on the right-hand side, you can see three areas: chat, question, and polls. Please put your questions in the questions tab because otherwise they might get lost in the chat session. I'd imagine they probably would be for this next Q&A, especially because I would imagine a lot of you will get very excited about what our speakers have to say about the topics they're going to discuss. So please use the question segment. If you're on a mobile phone, click on live discussion, and then those three options of chat, question, and polls will appear magically before your eyes. Now, let's move on, shall we? To say the world has been completely turned upside down over the last 6 or 7 months is rather an understatement. Many of us have never gone through anything quite like this. The spread of COVID-19 across the globe has had seismic and devastating consequences, be they to our health, to our economies, or just to our lives in general. For the sports industry too, there will be lasting impacts from coronavirus from a business perspective. So what could happen? How can those obstacles be overcome? And what new trends will be set? Well, at this point, it'd be useful to get the point of view of someone who's not specifically in the sports industry, but who is used to dispensing wisdom about the latest economic and geopolitical trends. A man who transformed a maker of wire supermarket baskets into the world's largest marketing and communications group, and managed to continue building his business through the UK recessions of the 1990s and the late 2000s as well. It will be fascinating to hear from Sir Martin Sorrell, formerly of WPP, now an investor at S4 Capital, in conversation with a man who's actually a bit of a mover and shaker himself, from early years working in motorsports via Valencia, my team. You can see them behind me there. Also Manchester City, to FIFA, and now the group CEO at 11 Sports, Luis Vicente. Really looking forward to this discussion. Gents, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Sir Martin, immense pleasure to be again here with you. I promise
good to see you again, Luis.
Promise that this time we'll try to make it shorter than our last conversation.
No, it was a good conversation. We covered a lot. Maybe we can cover the same ground here. Maybe we can just be as controversial. We'll see.
Well, so first of all, I've been a big follower, as you know, and you've been a big inspiration for many of us in the sports industry. Of course, you've been a breaker and the innovator in advertising, and I know most recently you started this great new venture called S4 Capsule. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it to start?
Well, when I left WPP, Luis, I didn't want to retire. I didn't want to play golf. I didn't want to play cricket either, because you need 21 other people to play cricket. So I looked at the WPP portfolio, which at that time was flat to up a little bit, but there were various parts of it that were growing, and one part that was growing was first-party data, which in a sports context, as you and I have discussed, is becoming increasingly important. So the data that teams have, that leagues have, that clubs have, using that in a coordinated and cohesive way was important. That was a growing area. Digital advertising content was a growing area, the sort of things that AKQA were doing, or VML, not so much a Wonderman or Ogilvy, because some of what they do are traditional and not digital, really. And then the third area was programmatic, and data and analytics. Data for the reasons mentioned before, but programmatic because that's the wave of the future around digital platforms like Xaxis at WPP, or the Essence Agency, which is a transparent model. I mean, transparency also has a message for sport as well, because one of the things I think that bedevils sport is lack of transparency and conflict of interest, but we can get into that maybe a little bit, just to be a little bit, stir it up a bit. Anyway, that model of first-party data driving content and programmatic is what we call the Holy Trinity model. And there are four basic principles for S4. One, we're purely digital. We're only interested in digital, not traditional. And then that has big impact for sport as well, because I think the future, and again, this is somewhat controversial to say, but I think it's really important. The platforms will become major sports investors, if they aren't already. I mean, they're already dabbling, I would argue, at the fringes of sport, but they are going to become more and more prominent, as will the streamers in relation to sport. They will become more and more prominent. So first, digital. Second, that holy trinity of first-party data, content, and programmatic. Thirdly, our execution, our go-to-market execution is faster, better, cheaper. Faster means agility, because in this digital world, you need agility. Better means understanding the following companies as well as you possibly can. In our case, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Tencent, Alibaba, TikTok, part of ByteDance, Apple, Microsoft, Adobe, Salesforce, Oracle, IBM, SAP, Pinterest, Snap, Twitter, Netflix, Spotify, Samsung, LG. That's the sort of group that you have to understand. So that's better and faster, and cheaper means efficiency, because efficiency is key in a slow growth world where there's very little inflation and you have to focus on cost. And the last point is a unitary structure. We have to integrate our business. The old ad holding company model doesn't work. So for example, when I was at WPP and we invested in Media Pro, a company that you know very, very well, we had a 20% interest. It tended to be too fragmented and out in left field, using a sporting analogy, and not part of Group M's offer, or indeed WPP's offer, or indeed our Spanish offer, because that's where Tacho Bennett and his friends were based with Media Pro. So that's the background to S4. So purely digital, holy trinity, faster, better, cheaper, and unitary.
Yeah. Well, I'll say, being in sports for so many years, that's exactly what sports needs. We need S4 and S4s, to take over more support of the sport. But I would like to know your view, because you've been, of course, dealing with sports for many years. I know that you've been for many years helping Bernie and F1, giving savvy advice in terms of Formula One.
I didn't help Bernie. Bernie always helps himself. No, I sat on the sidelines and watched Bernie. I mean, Bernie, just one thing I want to say, Bernie has his own way, but his own way is a pretty spectacular way. I mean, for all the commentary about, he didn't invest, one-man band, he ran it frugally. There was very little overhead at the center. He always outsourced everything. That may actually have been a very good way to do it. I mean, maybe the other way, where you invest, you may overinvest the other way. I'm not suggesting that Liberty are doing that in any way. But he ran it in his own idiosyncratic way, and it worked. It reminds me, my sporting involvement goes back to Mark McCormack and IMG, and Mark ran IMG not in the same way, but actually he built a business in his own idiosyncratic way, which is very different to the WME IMG way today, but in its own frame of reference was very successful. And I think Bernie did an incredible job on popularizing F1, and you saw the Austrian Grand Prix came back, without a live audience, but with a virtual audience, which I haven't seen the figures, but I'm sure it was a good audience. and it shows the appeal of sport, particularly post-COVID.
Yeah, correct, Sir Martin.
Sorry,
No,
sorry,
and you're touching.
I interrupted you.
No, don't worry. But you touch a very interesting point, because sports has been transforming itself over the years. Of course, I think there was many organizations very similar to Formula One under Bernie. Again, you
Yeah.
touch another one, IMG under Mark McCormack. But where you see today, and you see a lot of challenges, ahead of sports being disrupted. You've been disrupting advertising. Sports needs potentially more disruption. You mentioned now the rise of new players. You mentioned the big platforms, as potentially someone that is going to create a new dynamic. What do you think we are on that part of the process, on this rise of the new players? Do you think they are coming? As many people always asking, are they coming or they are not?
Well, everything around COVID-19 has accelerated the digital transformational revolution. So all the things that you, Luis, because you've had a lot of involvement with the sports industry, particularly football, but goes beyond that. Everything that you saw as a trend before COVID, it might be the plight, the financial plight of clubs. It might have been how players are remunerated. It might have been how players are managed. It might have been how clubs are managed. It might have been about the role of free-to-air broadcasting. It might have been about the growing role of the streamers or of over-the-top, of mobile, the growing importance of data. Everything that you could name, without exception, in my view, has been accelerated by what has happened. We're in the 15th week. I write to our people. We have 2,600 people in 30 countries at S4, and I write to them every Sunday, which I did yesterday, dutifully. Whether they read it or not is another question, but a few of them do. And it's the 15th week. In 15 weeks, we've seen a rapid acceleration. I mean, in our own case, our stock hit an all-time high again today. We're close to $2 billion in market cap, having only started, 21 months ago. We're on the fringes of the FTSE 200, having started from zero a few months ago. So everything that has happened around COVID has accelerated everything that we're doing. The move towards digital is accelerated. So what I would say to you is, everybody, those who are listening, if there is anybody listening out there or watching, just think about, this is a pressure cooker. This is a petri dish. This is an escalation of everything that we've seen. There may be some new stuff that comes out of it, which we can discuss. But I think this accelerates every trend, good and bad, that you saw before. So if you're managing a football club, or you own a football club, and you were worried before, or you were thinking about it, and you saw an opportunity, you should be more worried if you were worried. And if you saw an opportunity, you should be even more aggressive. I mean, I saw over the weekend, you and I were discussing what's happening in Italy, in Serie A. And I noticed a headline which said, private equity crawling all over the Italian football clubs. So look, in my view, and I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for this, I'm sure, there are too many, there are too many football clubs. There are too many football clubs. They have to be consolidated. Players are probably over remunerated. They will have to be remunerated in different ways. The leagues are going to have to be run more efficiently and professionally, because the competition is going to be huge. I mean, for example, what happens if we have a super club championship worldwide or European-wide or whatever? I mean, that's going to come at some point in time. The ramifications of that are huge.
Yeah.
And so when you think about football, when you think about motor racing, when you think about even a sport like cricket, and look at how that has changed with the IPL starting in India and on, huge changes. So I think you have to think about COVID as having accelerated everything, and things that you thought that would take 5 years or 10 years are going to be compressed into a very short period because it's escalated the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. You've been, I see, you've been naming it the burning platform, right, for digital acceleration. So, but you
Yes.
touch a lot of different points which are amazingly important in our discussion today. Again, you talk a little bit about investment funds and their interest about sports leagues. You talk about potentially new competitions that may come up. You talk about the problems with the player cost base currently in the sport, and that's common to us or other sports besides football. But if I pick up a point that for me has always been very controversial, but also is a very needed conversation. Is this now the time where there is basically a big movement, a big confusion in basically the established world of sports revenue? Is this now the time where a great new competition like a European Super League could come up, or a global Super League could come up? Will clubs, have the courage to do it? Will clubs find other ways of, getting the revenue that they've been so much pursuing? Yeah. What is your view on that?
Well, I think the change will come. I mean, I'm tangential to this, and I've had, when I was at WPP and when I was starting S4, and during the time that we've been at S4, I've seen very significant changes. I just specifically, I think the odds are that you will have a World Club Championship or a European championship. I mean, obviously, timetables are going to be extremely difficult, but that very idea will have massive effects and massive ripples on the existing structures. So,
Correct.
if I take the analogy from S4, we started S4, we're purely digital. Digital is one half of the media market. The media market's 500 billion this year. Last year it was 550, 600, because traditional advertising revenues, media revenues have fallen sharply as a result of COVID. But digital have remained remarkably the same. So digital will be more than 50% this year, 250 billion. Dominated by Google at 165 billion, Facebook around 65, Amazon around 20, 15 to 20, and TikTok around 7. This is a huge change for the ad holding companies. So as these new forms of revenue start to develop, you start to see huge changes taking place in the structure. I mean, CVC, a well-known private equity company, which was the owner of Formula One, and had, I think their investment, their usual holding period is around 5 years. I think they were in, CVC was in for 7 years.
Yeah.
CVC has gone into rugby. I think it's an open secret that they were one of the private equity firms that were interested in the Super Club Championship. Their involvement, and they are highly professional. Nick Clary, who runs, I think, their sports practice, was on the board with Donald McPherson at F1. They know what they're doing, but their approach is very professional, and it's very different. And the one thing about private equity that I think is important to understand is their usual holding period is about 5 years. So they naturally have a view of about 5 years.
Yes.
And often, I'm going to be cheeky here, often as they're making their investment, they think about their exit. In fact, one of the major criteria is how do we get out of this? It's all very well to get into it, but how do we get out of it? So unlike myself, I'm a dummy because I'm still I'm still the biggest individual shareholder in WPP. And I've been in it for 35 years. S4, I've been in for 2 years. I've said I'll do 5 to 7 years, and if I get a chance physically and mentally, and everybody gives me a chance, I'll do another 5 to 7 years. My thinking is much more long term. Private equity is short term, and I think this is something that the rights holders have to think very carefully about. Because they've always operated, at least in their own minds, with the long-term view. Private equity naturally, and this is not a criticism, it's a fact. Whether they agree with it or not, their view tends to be a 5-term view, a 5-year view. It is not the long-term view. So there is the potential for a sort of conflict in views. And I think that's a really important thing to understand. Having said that, I am certain 2 things. One is the platforms will become more involved. A very good analyst in New York, Michael Nathanson, wrote a circular recently about the value of sports rights and how, in his view, the value of sports rights was going to rise despite COVID, was going to rise still further because the free-to-air stations, such as a Disney, such as a Fox, now Disney and Fox together, such as a ABC or a CBS or whatever, or Viacom, would have to pay more to secure the rights, and would pay more because that would secure their audiences. And I wrote him a note saying, in your analysis, you don't include anything about the platforms, the ones that I've mentioned: Google, Facebook, Amazon, Tencent, Alibaba, TikTok. And he said to me, he doesn't think they're going to be players. And I said, I think wrong. I think they will be. And this creates real big issues for the rights holders. The rights holders have tended to go long, as I would call it, with their rights. You might get the Olympics going out, I think it's to 2032 with NBC. And it may now be more important for the rights holder to segment the rights, that they decide, for example, to give to sell the analog rights to one group of competitors, to sell the digital rights to others. I mean, already Amazon has made inroads into football. Facebook, I know, bid for the IPL in India.
Correct.
Facebook now owns 20 or part of 10% of Jio in India, Mukesh Ambani's telecommunications network. So the world is changing. Google, will I think be a participator in buying sports rights. Alibaba is already an Olympic sponsor. Tencent is heavily involved in sports. And it's not just physical sports. It's taking those sports and applying them to eSports or to the platforms themselves. So all these things are going to cause huge changes. And for the people who run clubs and have rights or leagues, this is going to become a much more complex, much more difficult, and therefore much more professional area. There is going to be no place for amateurism. No place for amateurism.
No, fully agree, Sir Martin. You're right on spot, because I think you touching exactly, a very important point, because there is many models at the moment out there. Digital companies are for sure looking at data, and data amplification as where they have a big advantage. Of course, more traditional sports rights holders are still looking at maintaining the status quo and maintaining, let's say, in a way, a certain form of guaranteed revenue. So, which I think personally, this is one of the biggest problems of the industry is how you move into a fixed guaranteed revenue to a share revenue. And I think that's potentially one very important point that also we saw in other businesses happening. And where you look today at the rise of new sports, and you mentioned some eSports as one potential new avenue. Do you believe in the potential, and do you believe most in the potential that also has on connecting with traditional sports?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking something we haven't discussed, but Robert Kraft who owns the Patriots. I mean, people forget that Robert Kraft has a massively successful private business in packaging, and I think it's the second largest private group beyond the Koch brothers. I think it is in America. But he also owns the Patriots, and he also owns a football franchise in New England too. And I always remember Bobby Kotick of Activision selling the franchises to his eSports. And I can't remember the price but there was nothing there. There was nothing there. I mean, this is several years ago. And Bob Kraft and his sons, who are brilliant at managing, to my mind, if you want to see, and I'm sure there are others that do equally good jobs, but if you want to, from my experience, if you wanted to see how to run a sports franchise and have the sort of 360-degree vision, because he's not just in American football, he's in soccer and he's in eSports, and I'm sure there's other stuff that I don't know about. That to my mind, he understands all the implications. If you go to Foxborough, you see the stadium development, the real estate development, the hotel development. I mean, he thinks about it in a holistic way. He's into the data side of it. I mean, he's developed the data side, beyond what the NFL, and obviously he's an integral part of the NFL, but he's developed it to a very sophisticated degree. And, I ideally love him to buy a UK franchise. Maybe he will buy. I mean, he likes bargains. If it's a good deal for him, it's a bad deal for you, I guess, is the old thing. But that, to my mind, he understands that. And going back to eSports, yes, I think it's a critical area. And I just want to say something about COVID in this context. We've seen three things happen very quickly, almost instantaneously. We're 15 weeks into this lockdown here. Now we've finished the lockdown here, at least for the moment here in the UK. But if you went back 15 weeks, immediately we saw huge interest in animation. Huge. We saw huge interest in robotics, shooting film. We have a robotics studio in Amsterdam. We joked last year that we have bought more robots than people when we brought it into the group. And that was a prophetic statement because, we're using robotics. We'll load during the day, we'll run it all night, we run it 24/7. But the third area was the conversion to virtual experiences with no crowds, we'll work our way through that over time. It'll take time, but we'll work our way through how you provide an environment for sports fans which is safer, before vaccines are with us, however long that takes. We'll figure that out. But in the meantime, virtual, we're at S4, we're heavily into this. Our content company, Media Monks, you can see them over my right shoulder and Mighty High over my left shoulder on the programmatic side. We're intimately involved in virtualizing with virtual reality, augmented reality, and 360-degree technologies. We're really embarked on a program of bringing sport in this constrained environment to the consumer, to the sports fan in new ways. So this is huge. And for those people that can't attend a live event, what COVID has done is amplify it. I mean, if you look, for example, in the music industry, what has happened on the Fortnite platform with music, it's huge. So using those types of technologies, which democratize what we have. So there's some complex decisions to be made. When I was on the F1 board, the continual debate was, should we sell the rights to BBC at a lower price and have massive audiences, or should we sell it to Sky and get more money but smaller audiences? A big debate. So that's going to become more and more important, and understanding that is critically important.
Yeah, I fully agree. I fully agree with you, because I think that's still a very dominant discussion in the world of sports today. And I think, of course, COVID, in a way, brought a reality check to many sports organizations, right? So that there is a threat to the volatility of the model that has been there for many, many years. We mentioned already, some very important points, how virtual and real, or virtual will become the new real, or become as important as real.
Yeah.
We talk a little bit about esports, but there's also one point in particular that I think personally is still a big gap on the world of sports. Is an area that you for many years you've been in a way leading that charge, which is the charge for data, right? When you look at sports and you're looking from a data point of view, you see this massive community, potentially the biggest community in the world. And the truth is, almost no sports organization understands their audience at the moment. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on your perspective?
Well, look, I broaden it because for every company now, and if you think about sports franchises, clubs, leagues, etc., as being companies, commercial companies, which is, one can say they fulfill a more magnificent purpose, but underlying it will be commercially. In the world that we now inhabit, and there's a really important thing to understand, is that Google and Apple have really now, because of concerns over privacy and interference in elections and brand safety, I mean, those were the three primary reasons. And now we've seen with the Facebook boycott, we've seen Black Lives Matters come into it too. I think there are other issues, no need to get into that at the moment. But because of this, Google and Apple have taken the decision, and Google's decision will take 2 years or a year and a half now to implement, have taken the decision to stop third-party cookies. So sources of data that come from other parties apart from your own data will not be made available in the way they used to. So first-party data, that is data on fan behavior, data on clubs and performance, whatever it happens to be, will become more and more valuable, and not only in telling you what's going on, but in being sources of data for other people. So if I can draw a parallel with what's going on commercially, Procter & Gamble, probably still the world's largest advertiser, Mark Pritchard, the CMO or head of brand, whatever you want to call him, has really, in my view, taken the Netflix model and applied it to Procter & Gamble. The company has 1.2, 1.3 billion consumer profiles. So they don't know it's Luis or Martin, but they have our IP address. They know what sort of media we're engaging with. They know what we're purchasing and what we're not purchasing. They take that data and then they try and devise creative messages that appeal to us. If we respond, fine. If we don't respond, they adapt the message in an iterative process. So it's not like you go and shoot a 30-second, 60-second TV commercial, which takes you 3 months in the Nevada desert or wherever it is. It means you're doing it in a much more iterative way. And I call it Netflix because I still think that the Netflix model is by far the best model that I've ever seen. You know, for a film like Narcos 3, a series, we created at Media Monks, or Media Monks created 1.6 million alternative creative executions. We then looked at what Luis was doing, and we saw that he was interested in football. So we compared Narcos 3 to a football team. Or we saw Martin on WSJ.com, and we served him a commercial which compared Narcos 3 to a business. So it's tailoring. So it's using data to understand what consumers want, what their emotional triggers are, what their psychological triggers are, and what their consumer habits are, and trying to tailor message it. So it's equally applicable to fans of any sport. You know, looking at what they do, how it, how they engage, and then trying to stimulate them, to stimulate their interests, and gaining execution. So that's, you know, that's a broad way of looking at it, but it's the same. If you own a football club, or if you own a sports team, this is what Bob Kraft understands, in my view. And I think that there are other examples. You know, I'm sure there are other people who are just as super sophisticated, but I think that's probably one of the best examples that I've seen.
But you agree with me that probably this data journey that sport has never taken is probably the biggest and largest untapped monetization opportunity out there, right? Because, you know, I still remember the days where, you know, and still today this is a valid discussion, that, you know, many sport clubs were discussing about the fan, and, you know, a fan of a club cannot be the fan of another club, but, you know, and things that today, okay, at least we already understand that this is absolutely not true. So because today is a fight for time and attention, right, more than anything.
That's right.
But do you think, you know, sports will once and for all understand that that is definitely important? I know that also in advertising that was for many years a big discussion. How do you think first-party data can definitely be at the center of sports organizations?
Well, listen, I don't know whether you can say definitively that it is, you know, the most important revenue opportunity. But for example, when you're, when it came to sports sponsorship decisions by commercial sponsors, and when large amounts of money were being spent on, you know, what are the great global events? It's, you know, it's World Cup, UEFA
Olympics.
maybe, it's Olympics, and it's Formula One. Those three. You know, if you're the head of state or a prime minister, and you want to change the brand image of a country within a short period of time, you know, what did Vladimir Putin do in Russia? What did he do? Sochi, Formula One, World Cup. I mean, it's prescribed, but in order to sell that in, you need data. And the sad truth, I mean, a lot of clients would say to me, you know, we can't make an informed decision here because we don't have the data to do it. And a lot of the sponsorship discussions or decisions that get taken, as you well know, are made for emotional reasons. I mean, I'll give you one example. I won't say who the company was, but it was motor racing. It was motor racing, and I remember it very clearly. Won't say who the company was. Big global company. That's all I'll say. And we were talking to the CMO or somebody not quite at the top, and they said, no, we're not interested in Formula One. Not at all. No way. I go to a race about 6 months after, and I see the CEO in a team shirt. I won't tell you which team. You know, a grease monkey with a spanner. And you know what the answer was? The answer was that the principal of the team, very sharp guy, went, saw the CEO. The CEO was a petrol head, and they sponsored the team. Now, that decision was made. It was probably a very sensible commercial decision. They probably got a commercial return out of it, but it wasn't made for the right, in my view, the right reasons. It wasn't a well-argued case. So the argument for data is that it provides you with a statistical justification for what are very, very big investments. You know, to be a top sponsor at the Olympics is a very expensive exercise. To be a World Cup sponsor or a European Cup sponsor is a very expensive exercise. And a lot of it is done for emotional reasons. It's not done in a rational way. Now, you may say, well, it's impossible to do it totally rationally, but you have to balance it. And I continue to be amazed at the number of decisions that I've seen in football and Formula One. Not so much the Olympics, I think, to be fair, but certainly in football and Formula One that are made for emotional reasons rather than rational ones. You know, for example, I don't think Tottenham Hotspur have yet sold the right to their stadium. At one stage, somebody suggested that we might help, was when I was at WPP with that. And a number, I won't say what number, was mentioned. It is very difficult, and it remains unsold, so I can assume that number was never achieved. It remains difficult unless you can provide a strong statistical evidence for it. And I'll be very naughty, actually. This will be very naughty. So Jackie Stewart, who I've known for many, many years, said to me, well, I mean, many, many years ago, said, would I call Willie Purvis? This is when Jackie owned his own team. Would I call Willie Purvis, who was the chairman and CEO of Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, and lobby him to sponsor Jackie's team? And I said, look, and he called me up and said, do you know Willie Purvis? And I said, yes, I do know Willie Purvis, but I am not prepared, Jackie. I'm not prepared to tell him to do this unless, yeah. So I rang up Willie Purvis and I said, look, Jackie has called me. I'm calling you because I know you. You know, Jackie's great, the team is great, but, you know, I can't give you a statistical. And Willie, bless him, sort of gave me an impression that the last thing in the world that he would do was to sort of sponsor that idea, sponsor the idea of a sponsorship. At the board meeting, the board approved at Willie's recommendation, and I think I'm going to say the amount was, I'm going to think it was about £6 million a year or something like that. But in those days, that was a lot of money. That was an example of the decision being made on, because Willie wanted HSBC's name to be known. No, not just, because I always remember it was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, always remember, I think it was Ken Clark, didn't know that HSBC had bought the Midland Bank. I remember that, and which was extraordinary. So Willie was always frustrated that nobody really understood how important the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC, was. But look, I think it's an interesting story to the extent that data is an underpinning for these sorts of decisions.
Yeah. Fully agree. So Martin, I know we have 1 minute left, I think, apparently, because, as I say, we could have spoken for hours, right? Because we need to start to do larger events, right? Because it's just too short for all the quality of the information you and all the storytelling you have.
You're just telling me
Absolutely.
politely to shut up and get on with it. Okay, it's all
No,
right.
no, never. I'll never say this to you. But one thing I also want to ask you, because you've been, to me, a very inspirational figure, even if we only met recently, but all over my time, you've always been a great model. What piece of advice could you give to the new generation? So the guys after you, after me, the future of the sport, what will be your best advice to them that are starting now in this unbelievable industry that you love and I love as well so much?
Well, it touches everybody and everything. I mean, not all sports, but sport as a whole touches everybody emotionally. People talk about COVID having touched everybody. Well, it's touched poorer people and disadvantaged people much more than it has wealthier, more resourced people like us. So, sport is different. It touches everybody equally. So it has immense power. And I just want to say that, it's impossible to segregate sport from politics. And the two things are just, you saw it yesterday at F1. You
Yes.
can't say it's compartmentalized. So, but having said all that, I think the key issue, Luis, and you know this inside out, is that sports is a business. I mean, there is a higher motive, and there is because it touches everybody and it's an emotional connection, but it is at its heart a business, and it has to be run professionally. There is no space anymore, no room for amateurism. And what COVID has done has exposed, at low tide, all boats are exposed, and the tide's gone out, and the boats are exposed, and you have to get your act together. So my advice is, this is a tremendous opportunity. So for young people thinking about going into the management of sport, this is a huge opportunity, but you have to grasp, as we're trying to do at S4, grasp the digital opportunity with all hands. It's no longer just an analog world, and you have to grasp the digital opportunity.
Sir Martin, thank you so much
Thank you, Luis.
for this amazing opportunity to be with you today. Your motto, persistence and speed, is definitely something that any youngster now needs to learn, since he's starting sport. But
the
for
other
me,
thing, Luis, the other thing is learn code and learn Chinese.
yes. Thank you so much, Sir Martin. It was a pleasure,
Thank
and
you.
I'm sure that
All right.
everybody had a great time, listening to you today. Thank you so much, and I'll
Thank
pass
you,
to
Luis.
David. Thank you so much, Sir Martin.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate your input there. I'm just about to go on Amazon and order myself Chinese and code for dummies, because I feel like I need to get prepared here. But listen, we darted around so many different topics. I'll summarize very, very briefly. Deep insight, stories and opinions, I think, sums up pretty much what we've heard over the last hour or so, talking about data, first-party data, content and programmatic. Also, what COVID-19 has done is accelerate every trend that we saw before, good and bad. Then some real opinions from Sir Martin. I'm glad that we didn't tell you to hold back and say what you really thought. Too many football clubs, players over-remunerated, leagues have to be run more efficiently, more professionally. Google will be a participator in buying sports rights. Maybe we should have a word from them to see what they respond. And there'll be no place for amateurism. We darted around, of course, data as well, and those key properties, that you identified there: World Cup, Olympics, F1, and done for emotional reasons, and the real need to understand our audience, tailoring data about them and their emotional psychological triggers and their consumer habits as well. Sir Martin, I don't know what your music is and I don't know what your gaming is, but if you're interested in that crossover, I'll direct you to Fortnite and Travis Scott. If you pop that into Google, you'll find out incredible collaboration between those two
Absolutely.
worlds that are colliding. And I'm sure that we'll see many, many more as we look at all of those areas you discussed: animation, robotics, conversion to virtual experiences. Wow. What a fascinating session. I'm sure that you guys enjoyed it watching out there in cyberspace. I feel exhausted having watched it myself, but very much fulfilled. Sir Martin, Luis, thank you very much indeed. And to everyone else, we'll be back very, very shortly with another panel on focusing on the football clubs as they cope with the coronavirus pandemic. See you shortly.
Thanks, David. Thank you, Luis.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Martin. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
David.
Ciao,
Thank
ciao.
you.
God bless. God bless. Stay safe.
God bless. God bless. Bye-bye.